The next display property is grid. Grid is a two-dimensional grid-based layout system that aims to do nothing less than completely change the way we design our user interfaces. Let's dive in the example for better understanding. Delete the previous code. Let's define our style for parent grid container with display property as grid and some height and width to it. All direct children of grid container become grid items. Now coming to the style of children, we will provide only background color for now. Define the grid container and its children. To define number of columns in a web page we use grid template columns, and to define number of rows we use grid template rows. By default, grid template row is applied if no grid template value is defined. Let's define 4 columns for our web page using grid template columns. In grid template columns we will provide 4 values with space between them because we want 4 columns. If you want 3 columns, then define 3 values. Value can be percentage, auto, fixed value, or FR. The FR is a fractional unit that helps create flexible grid tracks. The FR values will be divided between the space that's left after what's taken by the other values. Let's use all the value we can provide to grid template columns. Let's see the output. Oh sorry, I forgot to add some content to the children. Here the first column takes 20% width of the parent grid. The second column takes 200 pixels of the parent grid. The third column takes only the required width that is required to display the content. The fourth column takes the remaining width. Let's add some content to the first child and third child. As I said, auto takes only required space. Now, we want 4 rows in our web page. Let's define grid template rows with 4 values with space between them because we want 4 rows only. Great. Grid template rows take same value as grid template columns. So let's use all the value we can provide to grid template rows. It's the same working as grid template columns. The first row takes 20% of height of the grid container. The second row takes 200 pixels of the parent grid. The third row takes only the required height that is required to display the content. The fourth row takes the remaining height. As there is no grid to show, the third and fourth row remains empty. The text in the first column is not that we require. It's happening because we have given 20% of the height to the first row and content is more than 20% of height. The next feature of grid will solve this issue. The next feature of grid is starting and ending position of a grid item in grid rows and grid columns. First let's see start and ending position in grid column. I am displaying an image on the screen for reference on how to use the starting and ending position of grid. As we have 4 rows and 4 columns, so the line starts from line 1 to line 5. I want the first child to take 3 columns. As you can see in the image, a column starts from 1 and not 0. So to take 3 columns we need to put grid column start as 1 and put grid column end as 4, as we want the first 3 columns. Let's save it. The fourth value is set to 1 fr, so it's taking the remaining width. Let's change the auto to 1 fr in grid template column and grid template row for more understanding of fr. Great. Now let's set the second child to take last column. It's taking the last column only, but still I will define to show you. Now for the third child I want it to take the first 2 columns. Now for the grid column start we need to put 1, and for the grid column end set it 3. Save it. Nice. For the fourth child I want this also to take 2 columns. Put 3 for grid column start and 5 for grid column end. Now I am putting the values for other children. This is the end result. Now let's use the start and ending position in grid rows. This is same as grid columns. As we have 4 rows, I want the first child to take 2 rows. We can set the value of grid row start to 1 and grid row end to 3. Let's save. Great. Let the value of second child be such that it also takes 2 rows. Nice. Now I want the third child to take 1 row, so the value will be 3 and 4 for grid row start and grid row end respectively. For the fourth child I want it to utilize 1 row, so the grid row start will be 3 and grid row end will be 4. Now I am putting the values for other children. Great. We have successfully used the starting and ending position of a grid item. To put gap between the row and column of grid, we can use the property called grid gap. Grid gap take 2 values. The first is for gap between rows. The second is for gap between columns. Let's use it. If you define only one value, then it acts as value for both row and column gap. See. Same result. The next property is grid template areas. Earlier we were positioning the children grid using grid column start and grid column end. This property removes this brainstorming job for us. Grid template areas are an alternative to providing lines and offer a way to name grid areas so that items can easily fit into these named areas. As always, let's see an example to understand more. Remove all the grid column start and grid column end property from the child of grid container. Then define names of your choice for the children grid items with the grid area property. Don't use space between the names. When you're done with defining the grid area name, head over to grid container. Use the grid template area property to define how the named areas get applied like this. Let's show the same output just like previous one. The grid template area should include all the child grid, otherwise the output will be different like this. Please note, if you have defined 4 columns and 4 rows in the grid container, then in the grid template area property there should be 4 rows and 4 columns in double quotes like this. Great. If you want an empty grid cell, then use a dot in the grid template area property. That's all for grid display property.